Usually when we think about a blueprint, there is this immediate expectation of tangible reality.
Right, exactly. It's something you can actually touch.
Yeah, you look at that thick blue paper and you see the intricate white lines forming the load-bearing walls, the foundation, the electrical grids. The architect points to it and says, this is what we are going to build.
Yeah, it's a promise of something physical.
Exactly. It has weight. It has dimensions, a cost, and a practical purpose in the real world. You can almost imagine the smell of the concrete being poured.
I mean, because a blueprint is inherently a set of instructions for reality, right? It's literally an operational manual for moving dirt and steel.
But then you step into the world of modern religious interpretation, and suddenly that blueprint gets treated like a piece of abstract art.
Oh, for sure. It gets completely detached from reality.
It really does. We look at texts that historically were clearly meant to build functioning societies, and instead of, pouring the concrete, we frame the blueprint, put it on a wall, and just admire the aesthetics.
Right, we just stare at it.
Yeah, we talk about how beautiful the white lines are, how spiritual the geometry is, and we completely forget that we were supposed to actually build the house. We end up with a philosophy that is completely detached from the physical world.
It becomes the absolute definition of a structural illusion. And I think you, listening to this, have probably felt that dissonance.
Oh, absolutely.
That gap between the sweeping, world-changing rhetoric of ancient texts and the highly privatized, quiet, internal way those texts are practiced today.
Exactly. And that tension, that gap between the abstract idea of personal faith and the concrete reality of building a systemic physical reality is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are jumping straight into an incredible set of source materials for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a fascinating text we're looking at today.
It really is. Specifically, we have an in-depth analysis of Surah 9, known as At-Tawbah, focusing on verses 68 through 72. And we are working from the translated lecture notes of a highly renowned Quranic scholar.
And the mission for this deep dive is, well, it's pretty profound.
It is. We are going to shatter some of the most common and deeply held misconceptions about faith. We are going to expose the intense earthly psychological torment of hypocrisy. And finally, we are going to completely redefine what the ultimate reward actually means according to this text.
It is a necessary disruption to the modern narrative, I think, because the notes we're looking at argue a point that completely upends how most of the modern world views religion.
Right.
Today, society has largely agreed that religion is an intensely private, deeply personal spiritual checklist. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like it's just about your morning meditation, how you feel in your heart, your quiet moments of reflection, and your personal morality.
Exactly. But this text, it argues the exact opposite.
Yeah, the core premise here is a total shock to the system. It posits that true faith is a visible, tangible force. It is meant to establish a real-world system.
A functioning physical, socioeconomic reality.
Yes. And according to the scholar's notes, anything less than that, anything that remains purely internal, abstract, or confined to your living room, it might just be elaborate self-deception.
Which is a heavy claim to make.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because the text doesn't ease you into this concept at all. It immediately draws a harsh, unforgiving line in the sand by contrasting true believers with hypocrites.
Referred to in the text as the munafiqin.
Right, the munafiqin. And the way it defines hypocrisy is not how we typically use the word today.
No, it's not the casual hypocrisy of, like, saying you love a band and then never actually listening to their music. The scholar makes a very vivid structural point here.
Which I found so striking.
Yeah, it says faith is not just a parrot sitting in the cage of your chest.
Yeah.
It's not a pet that you possess, keep locked up, and, feed occasionally with pleasant thoughts.
I love that imagery, the parrot in the chest.
Right. True faith is a catalyst. It must be proven through action. And the ultimate undeniable test of that action, particularly in the context of Surah At-Tawbah, is struggle.
Right, the struggle is the acid test.
Exactly. You have to remember the historical context of these verses. They were revealed during a period of existential battle. The early community was under immense, crushing pressure from surrounding empires and hostile forces.
It wasn't just a philosophical debate, it was life or death.
Right. And in those moments of intense friction, the text argues personal interests absolutely have to be sacrificed for the collective good and for the establishment of truth.
And that is the exact crucible where the hypocrite is exposed. It makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Oh, completely.
When there is no pressure, when society is at peace and it's socially advantageous to belong to a group, it is incredibly easy to claim you believe in the system. Talk is cheap.
Right. Everyone wants to be on the winning team.
Exactly. But when the system requires you to give up your wealth, your comfort, or even risk your physical safety for the collective, the hypocrite flinches. They back away.
They absolutely do.
But what really stood out to me in the sources, and this is where I think you, listening to this, will find this hitting really close to home, is the scholar's brutal critique of token goodness.
Oh, yeah. This part is razor sharp.
It really is. The text explicitly calls out people who think that performing small, highly visible acts of charity makes them righteous, while their actual daily lives are deeply destructive.
It's a profound psychological critique. The source material describes a person who engages in theatrical piety.
Theatrical piety.
Like, they might be seen feeding birds in the public square or gently handing out water to pilgrims. They perform these highly visible, photogenic rituals of goodness.
The stuff that looks great on camera.
Exactly. But simultaneously, in their broader systemic life, they are absolutely ruthless. The text literally uses the concept of looting the world.
Yeah, that word looting is so powerful there.
They exploit their workers, they engage in corrupt, predatory business dealings, they crush their competition without a second thought.
It's like the billionaire who donates $1 million to a heavily publicized children's hospital wing on Sunday, but on Monday, their supply chain is actively exploiting child labor halfway across the world just to save a few cents on manufacturing.
That is the perfect modern example.
Right. They think the hospital wing somehow balances the cosmic scales. They think they've bought their righteousness. But the text calls this out as peak, undeniable hypocrisy. It says they are trying to bribe their own conscience.
And the text actually goes further. It describes this state of systemic hypocrisy as forgetting God.
Now, I want to pause here because this phrase, forgetting God, gets thrown around a lot in religious spaces, and it usually implies a memory lapse.
Like a cognitive mistake.
Yeah, like, oops, I forgot to pray today, or I forgot my spiritual duties because I was super busy at work, but the scholar's notes redefine this entirely.
Yes, and this redefinition is crucial for the deep dive. In the source material, forgetting God does not mean a cognitive memory lapse. It is an intentional existential downgrade.
An existential downgrade.
Right. It means the hypocrite has chosen to live solely at an animalistic level of existence.
Wow.
Think about how an animal operates in the wild. Its entire reality is dictated by survival, self-preservation, and immediate self-interest.
Right. Where is my next meal? How do I protect my territory? How do I avoid pain?
Exactly. When the text says the hypocrite forgets God, it means they have completely forgotten their higher human potential. They have forgotten the grand structural purpose of their creation.
Which is to uphold justice, build equitable systems, and stand for truth.
Yes. Instead, they have reduced themselves to a creature that only cares about its own stomach, its own bank account, and its own immediate safety.
That animalistic reduction makes the analogy used in the scholar's notes so incredibly powerful. The source compares the hypocrite to an illusionist or a street magician.
That is such a striking image.
Picture it. You are walking down a busy street and you stop to watch a street performer doing sleight of hand. They are pulling shiny coins out of thin air, tossing them into a metal bucket with a loud clink.
Right, a total performance.
Yeah, they are keeping you completely captivated, entirely distracted by the show. But the notes argue if you were to suddenly lunge forward, grab the magician's hands, and force their fists open.
There is actually nothing there.
Exactly. It is just empty air. The coins were an illusion. The bucket was a prop.
And that is the exact tragedy of the munafiqan, the hypocrites. They are performing a continuous, exhausting magic trick for society. And worse, they are performing it for themselves.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
It really is. They project the illusion of faith, the illusion of systemic righteousness, through those token gestures we discussed. The water for the pilgrims, the bird seed.
Right.
But beneath the surface, there is no substance. There is no willingness to actually sacrifice their own comfort for the collective system. It is a lifelong performance designed to deceive the world.
Okay, but here is where I need to genuinely push back on the text, or at least play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sure, go for it.
Because the text goes to a very extreme place here. It says that these hypocrites, these illusionists, end up in the lowest depths of hell. It explicitly states they are in a far worse position than open, vocal disbelievers.
Right, people who outright reject the faith and fight against it.
I have to admit, reading that, it feels a bit disproportionate. Why is someone who is just faking it, maybe out of fear, maybe trying to fit in, maybe just being weak, considered worse than an enemy who openly opposes the truth? At least the hypocrite isn't openly declaring war on the system.
It is a very natural reaction to feel that it's harsh. I mean, on the surface, it seems backwards.
Exactly.
But to understand this, we have to strip away the mythological idea of hell as just a fiery pit after you die and look at the intense psychological reality the text is presenting. The notes guide us to compare the inner lives of the two individuals.
Okay, so a psychological comparison.
Right. Let's look at the open disbeliever, the person who rejects the blueprint entirely. They have a clear, unambiguous stance. They have looked at the system, they have said, no, I do not believe in this, and they act accordingly.
There's an honesty to it.
Yes. Because of that alignment between their inner conviction and their outer actions, they actually possess a certain peace of mind. There's a psychological integrity to their rejection. You know exactly where they stand, and more importantly, they know where they stand.
Right. They sleep fine at night because they aren't pretending to be something they aren't. They might be the villain in this context, but they are an honest villain.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with the hypocrite. The hypocrite lives in a constant, agonizing state of duality.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. They're terrified every single waking moment. They're constantly looking over their shoulder, analyzing every conversation. Did my mask slip? Did they see who I really am when I hesitated to donate? Did that comment I made give away my true motives?
Wow, so it's endless paranoia.
Exactly. The text argues that the hypocrite's hell isn't merely a destination waiting for them in the afterlife. It is a psychological inferno that begins right here, right now, on Earth.
That makes so much sense.
They live a life of absolute paranoia, inner turmoil, and cognitive dissonance. The lowest depths of hell is the total catastrophic collapse of their internal architecture. They're constantly burning in the anxiety of being found out.
Wow. So it's not a punishment inflicted upon them by an angry deity. It is a self-inflicted, inescapable earthly anxiety.
Absolutely self-inflicted.
It's a constant low-level panic attack that never ends because the lie must be maintained forever. You cannot relax if you are constantly performing sleight of hand. If you drop your guard for a second, the empty hands are exposed.
Exactly. The psychological toll of maintaining a lifelong lie, of suppressing your true animalistic motives while projecting divine alignment, is described as the ultimate human torment. It rots you from the inside out.
Which honestly bridges us perfectly into the next major theme of these notes. Because if the punishment for hypocrisy is this highly tangible, highly psychological, earthly consequence, this paranoia and anxiety, then it stands to reason that the rewards for true believers must also be tangible, earthly, and structural.
Right, it's a symmetrical logic.
Yeah, we are moving entirely away from abstract, floaty concepts into hard geopolitical reality. And that brings us to the worldly tangibility of God's promises, because the text insists that the ultimate proof of faith isn't just a peaceful mind, it's a functioning society.
This is a massive paradigm shift for anyone accustomed to modern religious dialogue.
A total 180.
According to the scholar's notes, we need to fundamentally understand that when this text speaks of God's promises, it's not talking about vague, wishful thinking. It isn't saying be good and magically good things will happen to your mood.
Yeah.
These promises are framed as absolute, immutable laws of cause and effect, as reliable as gravity. And the primary promise made to true believers, those who actually align their inner faith with righteous outer deeds, is a concrete concept called Khilafat Filard.
Khilafat Filard, which the notes translate as succession, power, and authority on earth.
Yes, on earth.
The text is incredibly bold here. It isn't promising inner peace as the primary goal. It says the promise is a sovereign state, a physical territory where believers are free from the domination, exploitation, and oppression of others. It promises geopolitical reality.
Yes, and this is where the source material offers what is arguably its most devastating critique of historical and modern religious narratives.
The coping mechanism part.
Exactly. The scholar points out a massive historical pattern. Throughout history, certain Muslim societies, and you can see this in other religious civilizations too, eventually lost their political power.
Right, they were conquered or collapsed.
Right. They lost their sovereignty, their economic independence, and their honor on the world stage. And why did they lose it? Because, according to the text's own metrics, they had abandoned righteous deeds.
They failed the blueprint.
Exactly. They became corrupt. They stopped enforcing justice. They became the hypocrites exploiting their own people. But here is the psychological twist. Instead of taking a hard, painful look in the mirror and admitting, we failed the real-world test, our system collapsed because of our own systemic corruption and inaction, They invented a cultural coping mechanism.
Right. The notes are fascinating on this because admitting you failed, the physical blueprint is devastating to the collective ego. So what was the coping mechanism?
They retreated entirely inward. They retreated into spirituality, into mysticism, and into abstract esoteric philosophies.
It's so recognizable even today.
It is. The cultural logic slowly morphed into, well, we may be impoverished, we may be oppressed by foreign powers, we may have absolutely no political or economic power in the real world, but spiritually we are kings. In the unseen realm, we have mystical authority. Our saints can perform invisible miracles.
But the text is not having any of that.
No. The source text vehemently, aggressively rejects this coping mechanism. It argues that you absolutely cannot replace the loss of a tangible, powerful, just civilization with claims of invisible spiritual authority or magic tricks.
I love how you frame that. It's like a sports analogy. Imagine a football team that gets completely demolished on the field. They lose 50-0. They missed every tackle, dropped every pass.
It's a total blowout.
Yeah, and instead of going back to practice, watching the tape, and admitting they need to get physically stronger, they sit in the locker room and say, well, we won the moral victory. In the spiritual realm, we are the champions of the league. Did you see how purely our hearts were aligned out there?
That is brilliant. That is exactly what the scholar is critiquing.
It's an incredibly seductive defense mechanism because it protects the ego from the harsh reality of failure. But the text says no, the scoreboard is the scoreboard. If your society collapsed, you failed the blueprint.
That analogy is spot on, and the scholar insists that the text simply does not allow for that kind of historical escapism. The sources rely heavily on actual history as empirical proof of this law.
History as proof.
Yes. The notes point out that the Quran repeatedly tells its readers to travel the earth and look at the physical ruins of past civilizations. Names like Ad and Thamud are repeatedly mentioned.
All right, go look at the rubble.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes something vital here. Their destruction wasn't some invisible, mystical event that only happened to their souls in the afterlife. It was a physical, worldly consequence of their societal actions.
Their physical buildings collapsed.
Their buildings collapsed. Their economies failed. They were wiped off the map by natural and sociological disasters because their societies were fundamentally unjust, exploitative, and misaligned with the natural laws of success and stability.
So, to synthesize this for you listening, it completely flips the modern narrative of what religion is supposed to be.
Completely.
In our modern era, religion is heavily marketed as a soothing escape from the harshness of the physical world. It is the incense you burn to forget your stressful, underpaying job. It is the meditation app you use to cope with an unjust political system.
It's treated like a painkiller.
Yes. But in this text, the paradigm is entirely reversed. Religion is not an escape hatch from reality. It is the exact blueprint for mastering it. It is the operational manual for building a robust, enduring, and structurally just civilization.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Which immediately begs the question, if a sovereign state or real physical civilization is the ultimate goal of this blueprint, what exactly is the function of that state?
Right. What's the day-to-day operation?
Yeah, let's say these believers actually achieve this power and authority on Earth. They have the territory, the economy, the courts. What are they supposed to do with it? Are they just supposed to enjoy the power?
That is the critical pivot. And the source material directs us straight to verse 9.71 to answer it. This verse lays out the fundamental constitutional function of this society.
Okay.
It states that believing men and women are allies or protectors of one another, and their primary collective function, the absolute reason their state exists, is to enjoin what is right, which in the Arabic is maruf, and forbid what is wrong, which is munkar.
Okay, we need to slow down here because this is where the scholar's notes absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah, this part changes everything.
If you grew up around these texts, or even if you've just read a standard translation, you have heard those words, maruf and munkar, translated a million times as encouraging good behavior and discouraging bad behavior.
Polite.
It's always presented as personal morality, like telling your neighbor to be polite, telling your kids not to lie, reminding someone to give to charity. But the notes provide a groundbreaking legal definition that changes the entire trajectory of the text.
The linguistic and legal analysis provided by the scholar here is arguably the most important takeaway of this deep dive.
I agree completely.
The text argues that reducing marif to just being polite or doing good deeds is a massive, historically tragic mistranslation. In this specific socio-political context, the scholar explains that marif refers to valid, recognized, constitutional law.
Constitutional law.
Yes, it is the systemic codification of justice. It means laws that are inherently recognizable as good by human reason and divine alignment.
And Munkar.
Conversely, Munkar isn't just being rude or committing a private, personal sin in your bedroom. Munkar refers to actions that are systemic violations of human rights, things that are legally invalid, unconstitutional, and fundamentally exploitative.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It takes the text out of the realm of a self-help book and drops it squarely into the realm of constitutional law.
It really does.
And the text makes a very bold, logical claim based on this new definition. It argues that you cannot truly enforce Maruf and Munkar without an independent, sovereign state.
Because without power, they're just suggestions.
Exactly. The scholar notes that standing at a pulpit or standing on a soapbox in the park and preaching about morality while you are living under an unjust, overarching political system is a hollow imitation of the command. You are just making noise. You actually need the political, economic, and legal authority to implement the law and force the system to be just.
To really cement this, the notes provide a brilliant legal analogy to explain why this physical authority is absolutely necessary.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a society where a major criminal, let's say a corrupt oligarch, who has systemic power and has stolen millions from the public pension fund, is finally caught by the local police.
Okay, they got him.
Right, they've got the evidence, they bring him in. But when they go to court, the judge is forced to release the oligarch to go sit comfortably in his mansion on bail. Why? Because the specific law the police used to arrest him, the very mechanism of justice, was deemed invalid, or Munkar, according to the broader corrupted constitution of that land.
Oh, wow.
The system itself has legalized the corruption.
I see exactly what you mean. The overarching system protects the exploitation. The laws are written to protect the Munkar.
Exactly. So the scholar's point is that enjoining good and forbidding evil is not about whispering moral advice into the ear of the oligarch. You can't just politely ask him to return the pension fund.
He's not going to listen to that.
No. It is about establishing a level of systemic constitutional validity, Marshaf, where the law itself has teeth, where justice is structurally inevitable, not just a personal preference of whoever happens to be in charge. And you simply cannot achieve that level of systemic justice without sovereignty and power.
But let me jump in here, because this sounds incredibly political, incredibly legalistic. If I'm listening to this, I might be thinking, okay, this is all about state building and constitutions, so where does my personal faith fit in?
That's the natural next question.
Right, like our personal rituals, things like daily prayer, fasting, personal charity, are they just irrelevant in this view? Is the text saying, if I'm not a politician or a revolutionary, my faith doesn't matter?
It's a crucial question, and the notes actually anticipate this. The scholar emphasizes that personal rituals are definitely not irrelevant, but their definition, purpose, and scope are expanded far beyond the private sphere.
Okay, how so?
The source radically redefines two of the most well-known pillars of the faith. Salat, which is almost universally translated merely as ritual prayer, and Zakat, which is translated as charity or almsgiving.
Right, the absolute basics.
The scholar defines the command to establish Salat, not just as individuals bowing and prostrating on a rug, but as the collective maintenance of a just socioeconomic system.
That is huge.
It is the structural communal upholding of society, where people are interconnected and responsible for each other. And giving zakat is defined not just as dropping a few coins in a donation box to clear your conscience, but as providing the systemic means for humanity's nourishment and growth. It is an economic mechanism to ensure wealth doesn't just circulate endlessly among the rich, creating massive inequality.
So it's not just a spiritual tax, it is the actual circulatory system of the society's economy.
Yes. And the critique the scholar levels here is devastating. The notes argue that if you reduce Salat to mere physical exercises, just bowing and kneeling in isolation, or if you reduce Zakat to individual handouts of pocket change, all while the surrounding society remains deeply unjust, starving, and corrupt, you are missing the entire point of the blueprint.
You're just going through the motions.
Exactly. You're practicing the physical motions of the system without actually building the system itself. It is exactly like sitting in a car that has no engine, grabbing the steering wheel and turning it back and forth, making engine noises with your mouth.
That is a brutally effective metaphor.
Right. You are doing the motions of driving, but you aren't going anywhere.
You're turning the wheel, but the car is on blocks. You feel like you're doing something, but the reality of the world remains unchanged. So let's summarize the journey of this blueprint so far for you listening. True faith is not a hidden feeling in your chest. It requires tangible action. That action is tested through struggle, distinguishing the true builders from the hypocrites who are just performing magic tricks. Right. And the result of that action, when combined with others, must be a just, powerful, and tangible society on earth, a society that structurally enforces human rights, maruf, and provides economic nourishment, zakat.
Correct. That is the earthly blueprint realized. That is the concrete poured, the walls raised, and the lights turned on.
But what about the ultimate goal? What happens when you achieve all this? Let's say you build the state, you eradicate the Munkar, you establish the maruf. What is the end point of human existence, according to this text? Is it just a perfectly functioning utopia, and then we die?
Now we're getting to the really profound stuff.
Yeah, this brings us to what is honestly the most fascinating, mind-bending part of these lecture notes. We are going to talk about redefining paradise itself and the concept of the ultimate reward, which the text calls Ridwan.
This section focuses heavily on verse 9.72. The verse begins by mentioning the Gardens of Eden, beneath which rivers flow.
Which is the classic imagery.
Right. This is the traditional, highly recognizable imagery of paradise that has been culturally dominant for centuries, is what everyone pictures. But then the verse immediately adds a critical, superseding phrase. What Ridwanun min Allahi Akbar, which translates to, and the pleasure of God is greater.
Now, the notes dive deep into the historical and psychological context of that initial imagery, the gardens and rivers, and it's so interesting because it explains why the text uses these specific physical descriptions in the first place.
Yeah, the historical context here is key.
The scholar explains that to understand the text, you have to look at who it was originally speaking to. When the early Muslims expanded and eventually conquered the Persian Empire, specifically the capital of Deen, you have to remember who these people were.
Right, these were largely nomadic Arabs.
Exactly. They lived in incredibly harsh desert environments where water was scarce, agriculture was nearly impossible, and daily life was a rugged, exhausting survival test.
Imagine their psychological state. Suddenly, these desert nomads walk into the heart of one of the most opulent, technologically advanced empires in human history.
It must have been mind-blowing.
They encounter massive flowing rivers engineered to run directly through marble palaces. They see lush, manicured, infinitely green gardens. They encounter unimaginable concentrated wealth. We're talking silk carpets that took decades to weave and the heavy solid gold bracelets worn by the royal guards.
So the physical descriptions of paradise provided in the text perfectly matched the absolute highest possible worldly luxuries that were understandable to the minds of the people of that era.
Precisely.
It was the absolute pinnacle of human imagination for comfort and security. If you tell a desert nomad you will have rivers of fresh water and shade that never ends, you have given them the ultimate dream.
It's exactly what they craved most.
But, and this is the massive philosophical but in the text, the source notes insist that this physical, luxurious paradise is not the final goal. It is not the end point of human development. The verse clearly states that there is something greater than the rivers, the gardens, and the mansions. And that greater thing is Ridwan.
And here's where we have to clarify a massive theological misconception that the scholar spends a lot of time dismantling. It's a misconception that, honestly, almost all of us carry.
What is it?
Often, when people hear the phrase, the pleasure of God, they immediately project human psychology onto the divine. They imagine God as an emotional, highly reactive human king sitting on a throne in the sky.
I see what you mean.
A king who gets angry when you disobey his arbitrary rules and then gets happy or pleased when you bring him a gift or grovel or follow his commands.
Right. It's the exact dynamic of trying to appease a very powerful, very moody boss. You just want to keep him happy so he gives you your bonus and doesn't fire you.
Exactly. But the text, according to the scholar, argues that ascribing these fluctuating reactive human emotions like anger, happy surprise, or changing moods to the divine is a deeply flawed, almost primitive concept.
Right.
God is not an emotional being to be manipulated through obedience. God does not need your good deeds to feel better about himself.
So how does the text define it?
Instead, the text defines Ridwan in a completely different, much more profound way. It defines it as congruity.
Congruity. I want to really sit with that word. Let's dig into what that actually means practically.
Congruity means absolute alignment. It means structural harmony. The concept is that it occurs when a human being, through their righteous actions, through their struggles, and through the deliberate development of their self, aligns perfectly with the ultimate complete attributes of the divine.
Okay, so matching the attributes.
Think about it this way. If God represents ultimate, unflinching justice, you become perfectly just in your dealings. If God represents ultimate encompassing mercy, you become perfectly merciful. If God is the ultimate creator and sustainer, you become a force that sustains and nourishes the world around you.
That is beautiful.
Ridwan is that state of absolute, frictionless harmony between the human self and the divine ideal. There is no contradiction left in your being.
The notes provide two absolutely brilliant analogies to make this abstract concept of congruity understandable. But it can sound very lofty, you know?
Yeah, it can get very philosophical very quickly.
The first is the analogy of the morning walk. I love this one because it strips away all the mystical baggage. Imagine you decide to wake up early and walk 2 miles every single day for your health. What is the reward for walking? The reward is literally built into the action itself.
Right.
The reward is cardiovascular health, increased vitality, a stronger body, a clearer mind. You don't come home from a 2-mile walk up to your father, hold out your hand, and ask him to pay you $1 for walking.
Right, because the reward isn't an external, arbitrary payment handed to you by an authority figure. The reward is the biological, structural transformation of your own body.
Exactly.
The scholar applies this exact logic to righteous deeds and the concept of Ridwan. The reward of doing a good deed, of establishing justice, is not a golden coin dropped into a cosmic piggy bank so you can buy a mansion later. The reward is the immediate growth, expansion, and fortification of your own self.
Your own character is elevated.
You become a more complete, evolved human being.
Yeah.
That elevation is the pleasure.
And the second analogy takes it a step further, and I think it perfectly illustrates the difference between paradise, the gardens, and Ridwan, the congruity. It's the analogy of the employee versus the trusted friend.
This one is so relatable.
Imagine you work for a large company. You do your job well, you clock in on time, you clock out, you follow the rules, and at the end of the month, you get your salary. That salary is your basic contractual compensation. That, the text suggests, is like Jannah, the physical paradise. It is the baseline consequence, the natural outcome of doing the right things and following the blueprint. You get security, you get comfort.
But then imagine a second scenario. Imagine you perform your job with such incredible integrity, such foresight, such dedication and vision, that your boss begins to view you not just as a worker on the payroll, but as a peer.
Right, a trusted confidant.
A deep, unbreakable trust develops between you. You share the exact same vision for the company. That mutual alignment, that profound respect and shared frequency is entirely unquantifiable. You can't put a dollar amount on it. It's an elevation of the relationship that is entirely separate from the monthly paycheck.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. That higher alignment, that unbreakable trust, that shared frequency where your will and the divine will are indistinguishable, that is Ridwan. And the scholar notes that understanding this concept completely, utterly destroys what they call the mercantile view of religion.
Oh, the mercantile view. It is arguably the most common way religion is practiced today.
Absolutely.
The mercantile view is treating religion exactly like a transaction. It is the mindset of, I will pray exactly 50 times this month so I can buy a 50-room mansion in heaven. If I give this much to charity, God owes me a promotion at work.
Right. It is treating faith like a spiritual ledger, a frequent flyer program where you are just counting up points to purchase luxury goods in the afterlife. The text argues that this is an incredibly immature, almost childish understanding of the blueprint.
It completely misses the point. You shouldn't do good deeds just to buy a house in heaven.
Yeah.
You do good deeds because true faith is meant to transform your very character, to reshape your soul so that your self is perfectly in sync with the divine attributes.
That synchronization, that congruity.
Yes, that is the highest possible state of existence for a human being. The gardens and the rivers are just the byproduct. The congruity is the actual goal.
It is so profound. It takes the focus completely off the external shiny objects, the golden bracelets, the rivers, and places it squarely on the structural development of the human soul and its alignment with universal truth.
Which brings us right back to the beginning of our deep dive, the blueprint.
Right. So let's bring this entire massive conversation full circle. We have covered incredible ground today based on these translated notes, and we've moved from the deepest psychological anxieties to the highest geopolitical realities.
We really have.
We started with the harsh, unforgiving reality of the hypocrite, the person who lives a double life, offering token goodness like feeding birds while harboring a selfish, animalistic, exploitative nature. We saw how their hypocrisy creates a literal psychological hell of paranoia and anxiety right here on Earth. They are the illusionists terrified of being caught.
And then we completely stripped away the illusion that religion is just about quiet, personal, internal spirituality. We learned that the blueprint explicitly demands khilafat fil ard, tangible worldly success, and a sovereign functioning system.
We rigorously defined what that system actually looks like. It is a state built on maruf, which is not just politeness, but constitutional validity and structural justice.
And it is powered by Salat and Zakat, a socioeconomic structure that legally forbids exploitation, Munkar, and guarantees the nourishment of all humanity.
And finally, we redefined the ultimate goal. It is not just about earning a luxurious waiting room in the afterlife through a mercantile exchange of points. It is about Ridwan, achieving total, absolute congruity with the divine, aligning your character so perfectly with truth that the reward is the literal transformation of your own being.
It is an incredibly demanding text. It leaves no room for performative piety. But precisely because it is demanding, it is deeply empowering.
It really is.
And it is a necessary reminder to all of you listening. You have to audit your own life. You have to look at the blueprint of your own actions. Are you treating your values as a private checklist, just trying to earn spiritual points while the world burns around you?
Are you turning the steering wheel of a car with no engine?
Exactly. Or are you actively working, even in small, systemic ways, to establish those values in the real world?
Oh.
Are you just aiming for the paycheck, or are you aiming for congruity?
That is the ultimate question. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on the implications of what we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
We've established that this source material demands a tangible, physical system of justice on Earth, a real-world sovereign enforcement of maruf. It requires courts, economies, and physical space.
Right.
But think about the era we are moving into right now. We live in an increasingly digital, decentralized, and virtual world. Much of our economy, our socialization, and our power structures now exist entirely in the cloud. We have virtual currencies, digital nations, and decentralized autonomous organizations.
That's a really interesting point.
So how does living in a predominantly virtual world change how we enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong? Can a purely digital society with decentralized power and no physical borders ever achieve the physical structural justice that these ancient texts demand? Or by retreating into the digital realm, by building our utopias in the metaverse? Are we just building new high-tech illusions? Are we retreating from the physical blueprint all over again, just like the empires that retreated into mysticism? Think about that until next time.
We are constantly looking at the blueprint. The real question is, where are we laying the foundation?
Exactly. The blueprint is drawn, the rest is up to us. See you on the next deep dive.